The glittering costumes and dazzling performances of Wild West showgirls captivated audiences across America and Europe during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These women stood beneath blazing stage lights, their sequined dresses catching every flicker of flame as thousands of spectators watched their every move. But behind the carefully constructed spectacle lay stories of extraordinary courage, heartbreak, and defiance that history has largely forgotten. The women who rode horses at breakneck speeds, performed death-defying stunts, and challenged every convention of Victorian femininity lived lives far more complex than the characters they portrayed on stage. These performers existed in a peculiar space between respectability and scandal, between liberation and exploitation. They earned their own money at a time when most women could not, yet they faced constant judgment from a society that viewed their independence with suspicion. They traveled the world when most women rarely left their hometowns, but they endured grueling conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. The untold stories of these remarkable women reveal a hidden history of the American West, one that complicates our understanding of both frontier mythology and the struggle for women's rights. The first story begins with Lucille Mulhall, a woman whose name should be as familiar as Annie Oakley's, but has instead faded into obscurity. Born in 1885 in Oklahoma Territory, Lucille grew up on her father's ranch, learning to rope and ride before she could read. By the age of 10, she could lasso 8 horses with a single throw, a feat that seasoned cowboys struggled to accomplish. Her father, recognizing her extraordinary talent, began featuring her in his Wild West show, but Lucille was no mere novelty act. She competed against men in roping contests and won consistently, earning the title of America's first cowgirl. What history books rarely mention is that Lucille performed these feats while battling the constant pain of injuries that would have ended most careers. She broke nearly every bone in her body at various points, yet she returned to the arena again and again. In 1916, she survived a car accident that killed her husband and left her with injuries so severe that doctors said she would never walk again. Within months, she was back on horseback, performing the same dangerous stunts that had made her famous. She died in 1940 after being thrown from a horse during a routine ride, living and dying by the code that had defined her entire existence. The second untold story belongs to May Lilly, who performed under the stage name Winona and became one of the most celebrated sharpshooters of her era. What makes May's story particularly compelling is that she crafted an entirely fictional identity to achieve success. She claimed to be a Sioux woman named Winona, presenting herself as a Native American performer at a time when such exotic origins fascinated white audiences. In reality, May Lilly was born in California to white parents and had no indigenous heritage whatsoever. This deception allowed her to command higher fees and greater respect than she likely would have received as a white woman performing the same acts. But the performance took a psychological toll that May never publicly acknowledged. She spent decades living as someone she was not, unable to share her true background with anyone outside her immediate family. Letters discovered long after her death reveal a woman torn between guilt over her appropriation of indigenous identity and gratitude for the opportunities it provided. She wrote to her sister about nightmares in which she forgot which version of herself was real. When she finally retired from performing in 1912, she disappeared from public life entirely, living out her remaining years under her birth name in a small town where no one knew of her former fame. The third story centers on Bessie and Della Farrell, twin sisters who performed as the Farrell sisters in various Wild West shows during the early 1900s. The twins were famous for their synchronized riding routines and their ability to perform identical stunts simultaneously. Audiences marveled at their perfect coordination, unaware that Bessie and Della harbored a secret that would have scandalized Victorian society. The sisters were in love with the same man, a horse trainer named James Whitmore, and rather than let this tear them apart, they made an unconventional arrangement. James married Bessie legally but maintained romantic relationships with both sisters, and the three of them lived together as a family unit for over 20 years. They had children whose paternity remained deliberately ambiguous, and they moved frequently to avoid the scrutiny of neighbors who might question their unusual household. The arrangement only ended when James died in 1923, after which the sisters retired from performing and lived together for the rest of their lives. Their descendants only learned the truth when letters and diaries were discovered in an old trunk in the 1980s, revealing a love story that defied every convention of its time. The fourth story involves a woman known only as Black Velvet, whose real name has been lost to history. She was an African-American performer who worked in Wild West shows during the 1890s, a time when black women faced nearly insurmountable barriers to any kind of public performance. Black Velvet specialized in trick riding, performing stunts that involved standing on galloping horses and leaping between multiple animals at full speed. Contemporary accounts describe her as fearless and graceful, but they also reveal the racism she endured. She was often forced to perform in blackface makeup, even though she was already black, because white audiences expected exaggerated caricatures rather than authentic representations. She was paid a fraction of what white performers earned for the same work, and she was prohibited from staying in the same hotels or eating in the same dining cars as her white colleagues. Despite these obstacles, Black Velvet performed for nearly 15 years, saving enough money to purchase property in Chicago, where she opened a boarding house that became a safe haven for black performers traveling through the city. She used her earnings to fund the educations of dozens of young black women, creating opportunities that she herself had been denied. The fifth untold story belongs to Tilly Baldwin, a woman who defied gender expectations so thoroughly that she was often mistaken for a man. Tilly began performing in Wild West shows in 1910, specializing in bronc riding and bulldogging, events that were considered exclusively male domains. She wore men's clothing both on and off stage, cut her hair short, and refused to perform the feminine tricks that other cowgirls were expected to include in their acts. Audiences were simultaneously thrilled and disturbed by her performances, unsure whether to admire her skill or condemn her rejection of traditional femininity. What the public never knew was that Tilly's masculine presentation was not merely a performance strategy, but an expression of her authentic self. Private letters suggest that Tilly understood herself as what we might today call transgender or gender nonconforming, though such language did not exist in her time. She wrote about feeling trapped in expectations that never fit, about finding freedom only when she could present herself as masculine. She had romantic relationships with women throughout her life, though she maintained strict secrecy about these partnerships. When she died in 1958, her obituary described her as a spinster who had devoted her life to rodeo, erasing the rich emotional life she had carefully hidden from public view. The sixth story centers on Lulu Parr, a sharpshooter who performed alongside her husband in various Wild West shows during the 1880s and 1890s. Lulu was known for her ability to shoot targets while looking in a mirror, a trick that required extraordinary hand-eye coordination and nerves of steel. What audiences never suspected was that Lulu was slowly going blind due to a degenerative eye condition. She performed her mirror tricks even as her vision deteriorated, memorizing the positions and distances so precisely that no one realized she could barely see. She confided in her husband, who helped her maintain the deception, but she told no one else, fearing that the revelation would end her career. By 1895, she was almost completely blind, yet she continued performing for 2 more years before finally retiring. She claimed that an injury had forced her to stop, maintaining the fiction until her death. Her husband's journal, discovered decades later, revealed the truth and expressed his awe at her determination and courage. The seventh untold story belongs to Rosa Henderson, a Mexican-American performer who worked in Wild West shows during the early 20th century. Rosa specialized in trick roping and performed under the stage name Rosa Rodriguez to emphasize her Mexican heritage. What made Rosa's story unique was that she used her platform to challenge stereotypes about Mexican women, even as she performed in shows that often perpetuated those very stereotypes. She insisted on wearing authentic Mexican clothing rather than the exaggerated costumes that show promoters preferred, and she spoke openly about her heritage and culture in interviews. She also used her earnings to support Mexican-American communities, funding schools and community centers in California and Texas. But Rosa's activism came at a cost. She was frequently fired from shows for being too difficult or too political, and she struggled to find steady work. She eventually left performing altogether and became a teacher, dedicating the rest of her life to educating Mexican-American children. Her contributions to both entertainment and education were largely forgotten until researchers began recovering her story in recent years. The eighth story involves Mabel Strickland, a bronc rider who performed in the 1920s and became famous for her ability to ride horses that other performers refused to mount. Mabel's specialty was riding outlaw horses, animals with reputations for being unrideable. She suffered countless injuries, including a trampling that left her with permanent damage to her spine. What the public never knew was that Mabel was addicted to morphine, a drug she had started taking to manage the pain from her injuries. Her addiction spiraled out of control, and she spent years struggling with dependency while continuing to perform. She finally sought treatment in 1928, entering a sanitarium where she spent 6 months recovering. She emerged clean and returned to performing, but the experience had changed her. She became an advocate for injured performers, pushing for better safety standards and medical care. She also spoke quietly to other performers about addiction, offering support and resources to those who were struggling. Her advocacy work remained largely private, but it had a significant impact on the rodeo community. The ninth untold story centers on Vera Magines, a performer who worked in Wild West shows during the 1910s and 1920s. Vera was known for her Roman riding, standing with one foot on each of 2 horses as they galloped around the arena. What distinguished Vera from other performers was her intellect and her ambition beyond the arena. She attended college during the off-season, earning a degree in literature at a time when few women pursued higher education. She wrote extensively about her experiences as a performer, producing articles and essays that analyzed the Wild West show industry from an insider's perspective. She was critical of the exploitation she witnessed, the dangerous conditions performers endured, and the way shows romanticized violence against Native Americans. Her writings were published in various magazines, but she used a pseudonym to protect her performing career. Only after her retirement did she begin publishing under her own name, producing a memoir that offered an unvarnished look at life in Wild West shows. The memoir was largely ignored when it was published in 1933, but it has since been recognized as an important historical document. The 10th and final story belongs to Florence Ladue, a trick roper who performed alongside her husband, Guy Wiedeck, in Wild West shows across North America and Europe. Florence was one of the most skilled ropers of her generation, capable of executing complex tricks that few performers could match. But her greatest contribution came not from her performing, but from her work behind the scenes. Florence was instrumental in organizing the first Calgary Stampede in 1912, handling logistics and recruitment that made the event possible. She worked tirelessly to ensure that female performers were given equal billing and fair compensation, fighting against promoters who wanted to relegate women to secondary roles. She also mentored younger performers, teaching them not only the technical skills they needed, but also how to negotiate contracts and protect themselves from exploitation. Despite her crucial role in creating one of the most famous rodeos in the world, Florence received little credit during her lifetime. Historical accounts focused on her husband's contributions while minimizing or ignoring her own. Only in recent decades have researchers begun to recognize the extent of her influence and the debt that the rodeo world owes to her vision and determination. These 10 stories represent only a fraction of the hidden history of Wild West showgirls. Countless other women lived equally remarkable lives, their stories lost to time because they were considered unworthy of recording, or because the women themselves chose to keep their secrets. The showgirls of the Wild West challenged conventions, endured hardships, and created lives of meaning and purpose in an industry that often sought to exploit them. They deserve to be remembered not as mere curiosities or supporting characters in someone else's story, but as the complex, courageous, and fully human individuals they were. Subscribe for weekly American Frontier Outlaws breakdowns, and comment below with which historical period you want to explore next.